Well, for more on both those stories, joined now on the line from London by the international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Good to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz. Let's start with Gaza. Indirect talks between Israel and Hamas said to be stalling, with a key sticking point being on how aid should be delivered to Gaza. What's the latest that you're hearing?
Well, precisely what you've just stated. The real problem is that in order for the ceasefire to go ahead, all these sticking points have to be eliminated. At least there's only one left. It's a fairly difficult sticking point because, of course, this American group, which is organizing the aid, is somewhat shadowy, to say the least. And there are many people, not just in Gaza, but around the world, who prefer to see the UN in charge of it, which is the very thing that America and Israel do not want. I, however, believe myself that this sticking point will not be impossible to overcome, and so a ceasefire, as opposed to a truce, or let alone a peace treaty, is possible.
And the choreography of meetings between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu has given the impression that the momentum towards a ceasefire and the release of hostages was growing. But in his latest comments, Mr. Netanyahu repeated that the elimination of Hamas's military and governing capabilities remains his principal objective, along, as he said, the release of all the hostages. So analysts seem to think that at this stage it's unclear if much progress towards a truce is being made.
Yes, as long as we distinguish between a ceasefire, which is likely to go ahead, there being only this sticking point about aid distribution, and a truce, let alone a peace treaty, as long as this distinction is made, then there's no incompatibility between there being a ceasefire for some time, but no truce in sight. The central problem is that Israel and Gaza have actually diametrical goals. Israel wants to eliminate Hamas, and of course there are those who like to see Israel go from the sea to the river, but far more notoriously, Gaza, those in Gaza who want to see their rule over this area restored, and so, quote, from the river to the sea. And so from these points of views, these goals mean that any sort of truce is very hard to see. Moreover, Hamas wants to stay in charge. Israel doesn't want to let it. And therefore, we have another diametrical goal. This one is not impossible, but the sort of a temporary solution is of no real comfort to Israel, namely that Hamas will morph into something else under a different name, but essentially the same people running it who are anti-Israeli. And so from this point of view, it is genuinely hard to see that any progress towards a truce is being made. But ceasefire, yes.
Well, let's turn to the war between Russia and Ukraine. That's much closer to you in Europe there. Has Donald Trump finally lost patience with Vladimir Putin? Because Mr. Trump says he's been getting a lot of what he called BS from Mr. Putin, and now says that the US will send more weapons to Kyiv.
Yeah, Donald Trump is not just unpredictable, but volatile. And it's very hard to work out precisely what effect this has in the short term, even, certainly not in the medium term, because please note, just a short while ago, he was talking about withdrawing supplies from Ukraine. And therefore, as he changes his policy and lurches from one to the other, all that seems to be left is that Russia carries on as far as I can tell, as before, virtually ignoring what Donald Trump is doing in this respect, presumably on the grounds that if 1 week ago he was withdrawing troops and equipment, and now he wants to supply equipment, then the next week might see a different volte-face yet again. And so on that basis, there's nothing that can be really planned. As for Ukraine, though, it is important for a very simple reason. America has been, on the whole, negative about Ukraine and positive about Russia now for a long time. And so any sign by America, in particular Donald Trump, that he is listening to Ukraine and will supply weapons, more weapons, is very, very welcome. This is in addition to whatever military impact they will have, and they are important, please note. But again, the good news for Ukraine is Donald Trump is now on their side, at least for the time being, though we have no idea how long that will be for.
Indeed, because, I mean, in its response, the Kremlin says it's not worried. So you don't think it should be?
No, because we can't tell what Donald Trump's going to do in a week's time. As far as anyone can tell, Donald Trump changes his mind literally on a weekly basis. So on that basis, there's nothing to plan on. The Kremlin cannot be very worried because for all it knows, it could be friends again next week. What is significant is the fact that Russia is now hitting this town in the northwest Ukraine, which is militarily important because it implies they're now also talking about and acting upon a way of interfering with supplies getting to Ukraine. Yeah, so this interdiction. And so this is militarily important. And I think that's what they spend their time on, the Kremlin, working out how to advance. And whether Donald Trump is now on their side or not, I think is of secondary importance to them.
And the Russian media are suggesting that Vladimir Putin wants more than Mr. Trump is prepared to offer, more in terms of territory and in terms of concessions from Ukraine and in terms of shutting off Western arms supplies to Kyiv. I mean, does Mr. Putin hold the cards and therefore can hold out for a better deal?
I like the way you're using the word cards and deal, which is, of course, very reminiscent of how President Donald Trump now expresses these things. Yes, I think they feel that they are in a suitably strong position. They are on the spot. They can attack and are doing so on a regular basis. There is no shortage of equipment, it would appear. And so therefore they hold the cards. So therefore, why should they go for inferior peace treaty? Where Donald Trump is, I think, frustrated is that he envisaged a negotiation, whereas what Russia wants is a minimum set of demands met. The minimum is all the territory they're angling at, which they've only occupied for some, and Western influence out, and Ukraine, in effect, reduced to being a neutral satellite of sorts. This is not possible as far as Ukraine is not acceptable, and therefore, in this sense, Donald Trump is frustrated. Actually, Russia wants even more than that. He has hinted recently, please note, that all Ukrainians are basically Russians, but presumably would settle for these minimum demands. But President Donald Trump would like to see negotiation about these minimum demands. Hence, the reason why there is frustration and a view by Donald Trump that he can't easily see an end to this war that he thought he could extinguish in 24 hours.
So, I mean, you're a man with an ear to the ground and a pen to a book, several books I might add. What do you think all this means in real terms for the war in Ukraine and the way that Russia is prosecuting that war? I mean, does it look like Russia is determined to push on?
Yes, in a word, Russia is determined to push on. It sees no reason to stop. Please note, still North Korea is going to supply more soldiers. It has many half allies prepared to supply it with equipment if it can't. There's no obvious reason for it to stop. On the Western side, they are talking about the collapse of the Russian economy, for example. Well, they've been talking about it for over 3 years and no economy has collapsed. And so therefore, I think they don't really understand Russia, which at least Sir Winston Churchill was honest enough to state that it was an enigma wrapped up in a puzzle. But what is clear, if you look at it in this, there are some clear guidelines. Russia is not prepared to surrender its minimum demands because as it sees it for national security, it is still ambitious to take Ukraine and the whole of it, that is. And so in this respect, the war will continue as it is doing now with no clear end in sight as we sit now.
And what about your assessment of the Ukrainians and the level of confidence that they have right now about the possibility of achieving their objectives objectives by military means, and the objective being, of course, pushing Russia out of Ukraine.
Yeah, there have been recent polls, of course, in Ukraine, and they're getting to be quite war-weary, which is incidentally what the Russians predicted. The Russians stated, not without reason, the Russia's been fighting wars for centuries, including with Poland, incidentally, and they can last for years, I mean, decades. And so therefore they're quite used to it. But for the Ukrainians, it is absolutely a baptism of fire in every sense of the word. And with no end in sight, it becomes almost difficult to see why the war should continue. And so some Ukrainians are questioning this. As for the goal which President Zelensky set himself about making sure that Ukraine recovers all its pre-2014 territory, as far as one can tell from all the opinions, most Ukrainians regard this as a pie in the sky and would settle for some other sort of peace. But President Zelensky is in charge. That is the goal that Ukraine has set itself, and that is what is happening. Please also note that Russia is slowly advancing, which is, of course, a further aspect, which is why the Kremlin is not really interested, not scared of America, and why Ukrainians themselves are thinking of, perhaps some Ukrainians, of ending this war, but not on pre-2014 terms.
Dr. Laskiewicz, ranging with some ease there from Ukraine to Russia to the United States to Israel and to Gaza. Thank you very much indeed. And Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is the international affairs analyst talking to me on the line from London.